Okay, so, we've been talking about some pretty big policy shifts recently, but this one takes the cake. I mean, shutting down the entire U.S. Department of Education, that's a big one.
Yeah, no kidding, right? It's like a cornerstone of, federal involvement in education for decades, just gone.
So let's really dig into this. I mean, why is this happening? What are we looking at in terms of the fallout? Both the immediate stuff and then the long-term ripples for, how education works in this country. And thankfully, you've sent over some really interesting stuff that gets into, the background of the decision, the likely impacts, all the political back and forth, and even some guesses about what the future might hold.
Right. And I think the core of it is this, we're basically seeing a major federal agency just disappear potentially, which is, in the history of the US, that's not something that happens every day.
Right. So I guess let's start with, how did we even get here? How did the Department of Education come about in the first place? I mean, what was the thinking when it was created?
So it actually goes back to 1979. President Carter, he signed the legislation that created the DOE. And before that, you had all these different education programs kind of scattered across, different parts of the government.
Oh, I see.
So the idea was let's centralize this, make a dedicated department to handle, all the federal money going into education to create a national, education policy and to make sure everybody was following all the federal laws around education.
So it's kind of like, education getting its own, seat at the big table in Washington.
Exactly, yeah. It really became the way that the federal government, flexed its muscles, so to speak, when it came to education, which, historically was always seen as primarily a state and local thing.
Right. And this, move to shut it down, it's not like it came out of nowhere, right? I mean, in the material you shared, former President Trump had been talking about this kind of decentralization for a long time, right? So what's the background there?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of shrinking the federal government's role in education has been around for a while, and it's a big part of, certain political ideologies. The core of it is that a lot of people believe that states are just, better equipped to deal with, what students need in their specific communities.
They're closer to the ground, right? They see it firsthand.
Exactly. And former President Trump, he really latched onto that. It was a key part of his platform in both 2016 and 2024. He framed it as giving power back to the states, cutting down on bureaucracy, all that.
Yeah, and that, brings us to where we are now. I mean, this executive order, that he signed on March 20th, 2025, it basically tells, Secretary McMahon to start, dismantling the whole department.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is, this philosophical debate that's been going on for, decades. It's actually turning into, real concrete change.
Right. So okay, so what happens now? I mean, in the stuff you shared, one of the most immediate consequences is obviously this big shift in power back to the states, right? I mean, they're suddenly calling the shots when it comes to, what gets taught, how schools get funded, all that.
Right. And that's, that's both exciting and a little scary because, on the one hand, you could see it leading to some really innovative, approaches.
Mm.
States could really tailor their, education systems to, their particular, values and needs.
I mean, like, maybe a state with a huge tech sector could, really focus on STEM education or, something like that.
Exactly. And you wouldn't have, a big federal bureaucracy, dictating, a one-size-fits-all approach.
But I mean, the flip side of that is, and the source material talks about this, is that, the differences between states, the disparities, those could become even bigger, right? I mean, how do you see that playing out?
Well, think about it like this, states already have, vastly different amounts of money, to spend on education. Some states just, they have a lot more resources.
Right.
And without, that federal funding to kind of, even things out, the gap between the richest and poorest states in terms of how much they spend per student, it could just explode.
I mean, you're talking like different worlds, right? In terms of, the quality of teachers, the resources available, even like what kinds of programs kids have access to.
Yeah, it could create like a whole new level of, educational inequality just based on where you happen to be born.
And that kind of, leads into this, this huge number that jump out at me from the stuff you sent. It's almost $80 billion, 79 billion to be exact, that the Department of Education, handles every year. That's a massive amount of money, and it goes to, really critical things like Title I grants, for schools in low-income areas and Pell grants to help, low-income students afford college. I mean, what happens to all that money now?
That's the million-dollar question, or I guess the $79 billion question, right?
Right.
I mean, will the federal government keep giving that money to states? Will it be the same amount? Will they use different criteria to decide, who gets what? Or will states be expected to, just figure it out on their own?
I mean, that's a huge burden to put on states, especially the ones that, already have, tight budgets.
Exactly. I mean, you could see some states, really struggling to, make up for that loss of federal funding. Maybe they have to raise taxes or cut other programs. I mean, it can be really tough.
And then there's, another massive number we have to talk about, over $1.6 trillion in federal student loans.
Yeah.
That's affecting something like 43 million borrowers, and the Department of Education has been, managing all of that. So what happens to all that student debt now?
Well, the source material lays out a couple of possibilities, right? So one option is they move the whole thing to another federal agency, maybe the Treasury Department.
Okay.
But the other option, and this is the one that's, making a lot of people nervous, is they privatize it, hand it over to private companies to manage.
And I mean, with the Treasury, at least it's still, the government, in theory, they're supposed to be looking out for, the public interest, but private companies, well, their main goal is profit, right?
Right, exactly. And that's the big worry. If these loans get privatized, will borrowers still have the same protections? Will interest rates go up? Will repayment options become less flexible? It could make a really tough situation even tougher for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, potentially turning, the dream of a college education into, a financial nightmare for millions.
Yeah, it's a really serious concern. And, it's not just about the money either. One of the things the Department of Education does is, enforce anti-discrimination laws in education. They have this Office for Civil Rights, the OCR, and they make sure that, things are fair for everyone, regardless of race, gender, disability, all that. And the material you sent really highlights how, losing that central oversight could be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, why is that such a big deal?
Well, think about it. The OCR is like the referee, right? They make sure everyone is playing by the rules. They make sure that schools aren't discriminating against certain students. And without them, you could see some states, maybe their protections weaken or become inconsistent.
Yeah, so it's like, a patchwork of, different levels of, fairness and protection depending on where you live.
Exactly. And the students who get hurt the most are usually the ones who are already, facing disadvantages, minority students, the students with disabilities.
And the source specifically mentions special education, right?
Right. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that guarantees, kids with disabilities get the support they need in school.
Yeah.
And the worry is that without the DOE, some states might not, have the resources or the will to really, uphold IDEA, to the fullest.
Right. So it's not just about, the big picture stuff like funding and policy. It's also about, the day-to-day lives of students and their families.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the people who work at the Department of Education. The source mentions that, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 employees could lose their jobs.
Yeah. I mean, these are people who, have dedicated their careers to, education policy, to research, to making sure things run smoothly. What happens to all that expertise?
That's a good question. I mean, these are people who really understand, the ins and outs of the education system, and losing that knowledge could make it a lot harder to, to come up with new policies to address problems, at a national level.
So it's like losing institutional memory almost?
Yeah, kind of. And it could slow things down, when it comes to, tackling the big challenges in education.
Right. And it's important to acknowledge, that there are people who support, this whole idea of shutting down the DOE. So what are their main arguments? What are they hoping to achieve?
Well, as the big thing is this idea of local control, right? They believe that states are just, closer to the people. They understand the needs of their communities better, and they can be more responsive, without the federal government, breathing down their necks.
So more freedom to experiment, to innovate.
Exactly. And they also argue that, it'll save money, get rid of a big federal bureaucracy, less waste, all that.
Okay. And what about, the people who are against it? What are their biggest worries?
Well, I think the biggest concern is fairness, making sure that every student has a chance to succeed, particularly where they live or what their background is. They're worried that without the DOE, those safety nets, those guarantees of equal opportunity could disappear or become really uneven.
So they're worried about, the most vulnerable students falling through the cracks.
Exactly. And they also point out that, some states just might not be ready, to handle, all the responsibilities that the DOE used to take care of.
So it's not just about, philosophy, it's about, practical realities.
Right. And the source really emphasizes that we're in uncharted territory here. The full impact of this decision, it's going to take years to play out.
Right. And there are a lot of unknowns. Congress could step in and try to block it or change it. There could be lawsuits, all sorts of things could happen.
Yeah, it's a really fluid situation, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it all unfolds. But also, kind of nerve-wracking because the stakes are so high. And we're talking about the future of education for, millions of kids.
Right. I mean, this isn't just some, abstract policy debate. This is about, real lives, real futures.
Exactly. And as you've been listening to all this, thinking about all the different angles, the arguments for and against the potential benefits and risks, it really begs the question, what should guide us now? What principles, what values should be at the heart of education in this country as we move into this, new uncharted territory?
Yeah, that's a big question and one that, we're all going to have to grapple with in the years to come.
Absolutely.
Thanks for, taking this deep dive with me
Of
today.
course,
And
anytime.
to all of you listening, thanks for joining us. Keep those questions coming and keep thinking deeply.
And keep learning.
See you next time.
Bye, everyone.